Not a single country is as sanctioned as Russia at this very moment. You know that every single action must have consequences, and this is just the very least Western countries could have done against Russia for invading Ukraine. Whenever there were disagreements in the past between countries, this usually led to wars. But now, at least hopefully, we live in more civilized time. That is why instead of killing people, politicians now prefer to have talks, negotiations, and in the worst case scenario impose sanctions. You probably heard this saying by Eleanor Roosevelt, who said that you should learn from the mistakes of the others because you simply won't live long enough to make them all yourself, which I think it is a perfect representation of the current situation. Countries tend to share their achievements, discoveries, developments and share it with other countries, so it makes the development of the world that much easier. And those countries who just live by themselves, they have to go through all these stages all by themselves. Just think about your first couple of weeks at your new job. Let's say, so if you come there new and green and no one tells you what you should do, figuring out stuff will take so much longer. Or instead, as it usually happens, imagine there are people who will actually train you and show how things are done. In this case, you will obviously learn how to do things much faster, and you will become invaluable asset to this mechanism inside the company. And the same thing with the international relations between countries, which means that it is just simply imperative for different countries to stay in full cooperation as much as possible. But what happens if you isolate a country? Will Russia be able to survive on its own, and what will be the future of Russia after the sanctions? And these are the questions I want to talk with you about today. What's up, investors? It's the Russian Dude, and today let's just have this kind of philosophical, rhetorical talk. At this very moment, sanctions only started to hit Russian economy. In the very first months of war, Putin himself acknowledged that yes, indeed, sanctions were hitting the Russian economy. But obviously, soon enough he changed his narrative, and now he is saying that Russia is able to resist everything. And my question here from the regular person perspective, is that so? I've been speaking with my parents, friends and relatives who are still in Russia and asked them about their current financial situation. And the first thing almost every single one of them was mentioning was the prices. In the very beginning, when the Russian currency ruble devaluated all the way from approximately 75 rubles per $1 to like 130 rubles, all the other prices for groceries, cards, maintenance services, they also increased as well. But now when the exchange rate went below even pre-war times, guess what? The prices stayed more or less the same. As a result, people started paying more while making the same money. But I'm assuming that this situation will more or less even out in the nearest future, because this price stability is one of the biggest reasons why people go on the streets and protest, which obviously at this very moment is the least thing Vladimir Putin wants. The next effect of the sanctions is that many international companies have been leaving Russian market, and because of this the selection and assortment of goods has obviously decreased. Now you can mostly find just Russian products or products from allied friendly countries on the shelves. About 8 years ago, when this whole situation about Crimea and Russia and Ukraine escalated, Russia started receiving its first sanctions. And even though these sanctions were mainly targeting politicians and political parties, the response from the Russian government was to ban produce and services from different countries. Which basically looks like that the sanctions against Russia were mainly targeting politicians and those people who took these decisions, and at the same time sanctions that Russia was doing against other countries were targeting the population of Russia. Among the first things Russia prohibited on its territory was the food from different regions of the world. And at the same time, Russian government started motivating Russian farmers to produce even more food. And don't get me wrong, Russia is obviously a very big country and it has all kinds of climate zones and different farmers, and because of this, slowly but surely Russia was able to replace almost every single food item. Our grocery stores started having more Russian meat, eggs, milk, vegetables, fruits, and you get the idea. But back in 2014, when this whole sanctions thing started, many Russians were confused and angry. They're like, why would you need to prohibit cheese from France? But looking at the situation right now, you kinda start seeing where this whole situation was going since the beginning. And no, I'm not supporting Russian government here. It makes me even question myself myself, like, did the Russian government know since the beginning that one day they will have to escalate the situation until there's like no point of return? And were these counter sanctions and food bans that lasted for the last 8 years, was it just the government preparing for the consequences? But anyway, at least for now, it does look like that Russia can be self-sufficient and self-sustainable country for at least in the nearest future. And now speaking really quick about the cars. At this very moment, it is almost impossible to get the original parts for international car brands. And the way many services are adapting at this very moment is that they order these parts from China. And now I'm just looking back and reflecting on the past experience, I just started to realize importing cars into Russia and driving non-Russian cars has always been a problem for the last decade. For example, custom duties have been extremely high, and there is even this special luxury tax if your car price exceeds $45,000–$50,000. Obviously, not a single favorite Putin's Lada costs that much. So by doing these incredibly high taxes, Putin was basically discouraging people from driving non-Russian cars. And who knows, maybe in the future Russians will only be driving Ladas, just like Putin wanted. And so here, just once again, I can ask myself the same one question. Did the government know all along that at one point they'll have to escalate the situation so much, so that in advance they started preparing for potential deficit? So yes, this was just the very first two examples that came into my head, because these are the things that people use every day. People obviously eat every day, and most of people, they drive cars every day. And you might not know this, but the mindset of most post-Soviet people is basically the same. Whenever there are some sorts of hardships, people obviously complain at first, but then they kinda give up and they start adjusting to this new normal, which is very unfortunate, but that's the reality. Think about many protests in Russia in the past. For example, whenever people were unhappy with the elections, or whenever they were supporting this main opposition guy, Alexei Navalny, or even the protests against the war. People went on the streets for 1, maximum 2 months, and then they just gave up. For this reason, I think the same thing will happen with the sanctions and all the deficit. People most likely will not like it at first, but then they will just accept it. Especially because Russian propaganda always emphasizes how great, independent and self-sufficient Russian people are, and that they don't need anyone. And eventually, this leads to a desired outcome for the government. Instead of saying, why cannot I choose between French wine and Italian wine, people will now saying, why do I even need a French wine, because Russian wine is not even that bad and it's cheaper. But you know what, the time will pass and the war will hopefully be over soon, which means that eventually Western countries will start gradually removing the sanctions. And I guess it will not even kinda matter if Russia will achieve this ethereal goals of liberating some regions in Ukraine. For as long as there is no more military actions, this is when most people will be happy. War is extremely expensive, that is why Western countries will accept the cease of fire as probable end of the war. And eventually, once again, this will be the main trigger to desanction Russia. But yeah, of course, in case there are still geopolitical issues, the main sanctions will stay in place. But once again, as long as there is no more shooting, the sanctions against regular people and just civilian way of living will hopefully start lifting. So as a result, I think, yes, Russia will survive the sanctions. And even though some of you might hate the country, please don't forget that there are millions of Russians who have nothing to do with the actions taken by the government. There are millions of us who are against the war and we say it. And there are even more Russians who do not like how the things go, but they're just afraid to speak out. And sanctions, they do have effect on these people as well. And I really hope that this meaningless war will be over soon, so that people of Russia and Ukraine can go back to their normal lives. My family from Ukrainian side is struggling physically, and my family from Russian side is mainly struggling financially. But in the end, both of them struggle because of the actions that were taken without even asking them by the people who will not even close experience anything that people of both of these countries experience at this very moment.